Good evening, everyone. We're going to start to get things underway. It's been a pretty rough day of weather, so I applaud everyone who's made the trip. It's now lovely, but welcome to another lecture in the Sydney Asian Art Series. My name is Olivier Krischer. For those of you who don't know me, I'm currently acting director at the China Studies Centre. And the series is supported by the China Studies Centre, Power Institute, and especially VisAsia, in collaboration with the Art Gallery of New South Wales. This is the third year, and the series has continued to bring to Sydney leading thinkers in historical, contemporary, Asian art research of all kinds. In 2019, under the theme Art and Urban Cultures, our distinguished speakers have explored the intersection of art, film, architecture, as we'll hear from today, in a range of Asian cities. They've considered urban spaces as sites of taste-making, as hypothetical futures, shared pasts, ruins of the present, or stages for the formation of, or reformation of political identities. In March, some of you may have been here for Susan Babet's talk on gustatory and visual experience in Safavid paintings of elite urban life in 16th and 17th century Persia. Suzanne was here from the Courtauld Institute in London. In May, we were very lucky also to have Malini Guha from Carleton University in Canada discussing how location shooting in contemporary Kolkata cinema not only documents recent urban change, but also projects images of a global urban future. More recently, last month, from cities of the future to ruins of the present, we heard from Yasufumi Nakamori, who's the curator of international art and photography at Tate Modern in London. And he was presenting a history of Japanese photography through images of natural disaster and the destruction and reconstruction of cityscapes as documented in that medium, all the way from the mid-19th century through to the 2011 Tohoku natural sort of triple disaster, you could say, with the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear incident, particularly in the recent work of Hatakeyama Naoya. And so tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Paul Ruskin. You can see the title of his talk here, but I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Cole's work. Cole is Associate Professor of Architectural History in the Department of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong. His research examines architecture's role in mediating moments of transnational interaction and exchange between China and other parts of the world. His first book, which was published earlier this year with University of Washington Press, was entitled Improvised City Architecture and Governance in Shanghai, 1843 to 1937. And it explored the ways architectural forms were developed to manage the bustling treaty port of modern Shanghai, analyzing a range of architectural forms, including official buildings, monuments, parks, etc., but also, particularly in one chapter entitled Exhibiting a Modern Chinese Architecture, it examined the depiction of architectural forms and the exhibition format itself in the form of universal expositions, the kind in which any would-be modern nation at the time was performing its sovereign identity. His current project, from which we'll hear, a book project from which we'll hear a little bit of this evening, seems to develop, I think, these ideas on the relationship of architectural form to modes of governance and perceptions of cultural sovereignty and identity. His talk tonight will share a part of this research on the exhibition design and architecture of Reform-era China from the 1970s through the 1980s. I'd also like to mention, for those of you who can make it, there will be a roundtable discussion on the topic of museums and cultural districts in Asia and Australia on Saturday at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. For those unfamiliar, the format of the series is usually that we have one event here at the university and one at the gallery, and that's been, I think, very successful. The event on Saturday will be, in addition to Cole, I'll be moderating, and we'll have on the panel Dr. Anna Lawrenson, who I'm happy to see here this evening, lecturer in museum studies here at the university, as well as Professor Lu Duanfang, Professor of Architecture in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning. So join us at 2 p.m. in the Domain Theatre at the Archeological New South Wales if you can. Also, I should say, while this is the final lecture in the series this year, the Sydney Asian Arts Series has recently confirmed the commitment of all the partners, including the China Studies Centre, for the continuation of the series in its current form, and so we're underway programming for the 2020 series on the theme of art and technology. So without further ado, I have one other reminder, which Katie, who I would like to thank at the same time for organising such a fantastic series and keeping us usually on time. Katie has reminded me to say that at the end of the lecture there will be a slide for audience responses, a survey. I can't offer you a prize, but I do encourage you to give us your feedback. There's a QR code for those of you who can make that work. There's a QR code that will take you straight to a survey, so have a look at that. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Ruskin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olivier, and be gentle in the survey, please. It's really a pleasure to be here. Let me just set myself up, make sure I don't run over time. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. I'm based in Hong Kong at the University of Hong Kong in the Faculty of Architecture, where I teach architectural history at the undergraduate, graduate, and the PhD levels. And this is material, as Olivier mentioned, that comes out of a new, recently completed book project. I would be remiss not to thank Olivier directly for all of his help and the logistics and the organization of this event, and Katie as well for all of her work. Lee Ozinga for helping me with logistics, the Power Institute, of course, the China Studies Center, the University of Sydney, VisAsia, and the Art Gallery New South Wales, as well as the Sydney Asian Art Series, kind of the umbrella bringing all of this together. So it's an honor and a treat to be here. And I look forward to hearing comments and questions about the work. Beginning in 1971, an unprecedented number of new architectural projects began to materialize in a number of major Chinese cities, including Beijing and Guangzhou. A new 34,000 square meter residential compound for foreign diplomats emerged in the nation's capital, anchored by two 16-story towers and a series of smaller 5- and 7-story residential blocks. It was eventually completed in 1974. Over the course of 1973 and 1974, the project was joined by Beijing's first international club, its friendship store, where expatriates could buy foreign imported goods, and an east extension to the Beijing Hotel, which became Beijing's tallest building, eclipsing the diplomatic towers that I just showed. Outside Guangzhou and Guilin, construction was completed on a series of guest houses for party cadres, including the Hot Springs Guest House, shown here, located outside Guangzhou, and designed by Chen Weilian, Li Huiren, and members of the Guangzhou City Planning Bureau. The Reed Cliff Reception Room, another project imagined by Sheng Guo, was built over roughly the same period of time outside Guilin. In Guangzhou, a new exhibition hall designed by members of the Guangzhou Institute of Architectural Design began to materialize in anticipation of the city's annual trade fair, which was China's largest annual export commodities exposition. Also completed in 1974, the new edifice was the largest civic structure ever undertaken in Guangdong province and featured a 600-foot-long wall composed of transparent glass, the first of its kind in China. An adjacent service building, which is shown just behind the exhibition hall, featured an air-conditioned 750-seat cinema, offices for telegrams and long-distance telephone, as well as international shipping and banking operations. In coincidence with the completion of the export trade hall, several other major infrastructural initiatives were also completed in anticipation of increased business traffic between Guangzhou and Hong Kong. They included a 2-story VIP house in Shenzhen, a stopover town located 90 miles south of Guangzhou along the China-Hong Kong border, which was completed in 1974. Plans also surfaced for the construction of a modern highway directly linking Hong Kong to Guangzhou for the first time. Now, for anyone who's familiar with this period, and particularly the Cultural Revolution, these projects materialized at an odd, somewhat uncertain moment. The Cultural Revolution, which was launched in 1966 and officially ran until 1976, was a socio-political movement launched by the CCP chairman Mao Zedong and others to reinsert authority over the party's existing hierarchy by rooting out and punishing perceived elites through prolonged class warfare. China's state-run media outlets worked to depict this explosion in construction as evidence of the revolution's successes and the manifold diplomatic and economic achievements being realized by the uninterrupted progress of Chairman Mao's revolution. Publications such as Renmin Ribao, People's Daily, the nation's largest newspaper, lauded both the buildings and their laborers as embodiments of Chairman Mao's unified struggle against class enemies through constant revolution, and a refutation of anti-revolutionary theories privileging tropes of individual architects as possessing innate genius, or the notion that singular heroes make history, or 英雄创造历史. Collectively, however, these architectural projects departed from many of the aesthetic, programmatic, and technological norms associated with the Cultural Revolution. Each gestured toward international design trends common in other parts of the world, but considered by party leaders as somewhat inappropriate in the midst of class struggle. As a group, then, these spaces and programs, I would suggest, reveal the emergence of another socio-political project at work, one largely antithetical to the utopian aims of the Cultural Revolution, and instead intended to facilitate more substantive international diplomatic and economic exchange between China and both the capitalist and the socialist worlds. Now, over the past 7 years, I've been studying these and other projects in an effort to better understand architecture's anticipation of and participation in China's economic liberalization after 1978. These works, I argue, challenge many of the standard temporal, spatial, and ideological frameworks that we use to define the early reform era. And some of the key questions that have guided this research include: what can we learn from spaces like this that preceded 1978 and seemed again to sort of gesture towards more dramatic economic and social changes ahead? These are two projects that predate that 1978 hinge. What does building types such as the International Hotel, for example, indicate with respect to how space was used to channel and control the flow of capital into China after Mao? And on my left, we're looking at one of the first Sino-foreign joint venture projects for the Jianguo Fandian, or the Jianguo Hotel, built in Beijing and completed in 1982 by the Chinese-American architect Clement Chen. And on the right is a poster for an exhibition that I curated several years ago at the Ulan Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, which looked at 7 of these major international hotel projects to understand exactly how they worked as interfaces in economic liberalization. Other questions that I'm asking through this work include: how did the importation and translation of something like postmodern theory, for example, into early reform era China reshape disciplinary debate and contribute to architectural discourse and broader conversations with respect to the built environment? And here we're looking at 2 early translated works of what could be understood as postmodern texts or theories. On the left, Frederick Jameson's seminal work on postmodernism, and on the right is a Chinese translation of a book that was based on John Portman's book, The Architect as Developer. As China was importing these new architectural ideas, it was also exporting design abroad. And the questions that I'm asking also include how China's involvement in places, for example, the African continent, in this project, Kenya, and the construction of a gymnasium in 1987 for the All Africa Games. What do these projects and the South-South exchanges at their core reveal with respect to reform. And then ultimately, and kind of the broader question that I ask through the research is, how was the architectural profession itself in China contributing and changing in relationship to liberalization? And this is a diagram showing a comparison between the management structure of a typical design institute in China and some of the proposed changes being made in relationship to more market-based private architectural practice. Now, this work has been funded by the Graham Foundation and the Center for the Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, and it composes a just completed book-length manuscript that I hope to be published next year. And it builds upon my previous book, which Olivier mentioned, also published earlier this year, on Shanghai and the treaty port era. And the connection between the two really extends to a study of architecture's relationship to economic and political change in China. Both projects explore architecture's capacity to mediate China's relationship to the world. And in both studies, I'm interested in understanding how architecture was used by governing authorities in and outside China to anticipate and react to consequential moments of change. So what I want to do this evening and what I'd like to share with you is research related to the second newly completed project. In particular, the role of design and exhibition space in anticipating and contributing to the process of reform. Design, defined as the action of conceiving of and producing a plan or drawing of something before it is made, is anticipatory by its very nature. And I argue that it was essential to China's reorientation toward capitalism, a decades-long shift that roiled internal party politics and the country at large, consequently altering Chinese society in the process. Design took many shapes and forms, from buildings to processes to objects to environments. Its variability, in fact, made it a crucial component of the party's efforts to hasten the production of one socioeconomic reality within another, by enabling new, more market-friendly practices and modes of thinking to take root in physical environments designed for socialism. Design's ability to simultaneously demarcate, restrict, and interiorize behavior and activity through space and form proved vital to these efforts. So what I'd like to do tonight is discuss the designs for two international exhibitions, including the exhibition of archaeological finds of the People's Republic of China, which traveled around the world between 1974 and 1979, and an exhibition devoted to everyday life in China organized by the Pompidou Center in Paris from May to September 1982. And I want to use both events to argue for the importance of design to the broader project of reform. Both shows illuminate how design and the display of objects more generally contributed to a period of enormous and consequential transformation. Each, I argue, illustrates the extent to which reform was much more than a domestic process of change that was both specific to and contained within the geopolitical boundaries of China itself. Rather, reform was one with obvious international dimensions that at times posed challenges to the party's vision of what reform was and how it would be enacted. Each event also broadly speaks to the significance of material culture in understanding recent Chinese history. So I'll begin with the earlier event, the exhibition of archaeological finds of the People's Republic of China. And following the launching of the construction of those projects in Beijing and Guangzhou that I mentioned, efforts on the part of the party to pivot away from the Cultural Revolution reached a crescendo of sorts in February 1972, following President Richard Nixon's visit to Beijing, when both American and Chinese officials agreed to meet in an effort to establish stronger diplomatic ties with each other. There were obvious and delicate diplomatic issues involved. In particular, American officials needed to both indicate an openness to establishing relations of some kind with the PRC without jeopardizing their existing diplomatic recognition of the Republic of China, Taiwan, even as party officials in mainland China insisted that the United States acknowledge that there existed only one China. Faced with the daunting prospects of extended negotiations over the issue, officials looked to architecture as a means by which some measure of diplomatic leeway and progress could be claimed by both sides without inflaming the geopolitical risks and sensitivities involved. In 1974, it was proposed to establish what were defined as two liaison offices in Beijing and Washington, D.C., to serve as physical and administrative mechanisms capable of facilitating diplomatic and commercial as well as cultural exchange between the PRC and the United States, without rupturing America's existing relations with Taiwan. The indistinct, tentative nature of these buildings and their functions were, in fact, essential components of their shared purpose, insofar as it allowed both offices to function, quote, practically as embassies and consulates, end quote, despite no legal basis to do so. The establishment of these offices was followed by a rapid exchange of diplomatic and intelligence personnel. In Washington, China's liaison office quickly ballooned to 80 staff, while in Beijing, 26 American employees and a rotating team of American Marines worked within the compound and lived in the nearby Friendship and recently completed Beijing hotels, which I showed in an earlier slide. Through each office, a basic rehearsal of diplomatic life began to materialize. Official parties were held and receptions, which provided opportunities for American and Chinese representatives to acquaint themselves with each other, while also providing insights into the administrative frameworks and the institutional hierarchies behind each edifice. Clandestine activities also took place in relation to these spaces. Chinese officials, for example, began to collect information on the size and the composition of ethnically Chinese communities in the greater Washington, D.C. area. In Beijing, American fears arose over the likelihood that their liaison office was bugged, and American officials installed, quote, a so-called bubble, a classified conference room built of plastic inside another room, end quote, with no windows and no blowing fans, so that conversations could not be heard. James Roderick Lilly, the CIA's first China-based station chief, successfully secured half of the liaison office's communications room for CIA purposes, and he installed a dark room in the facility to share with State Department colleagues. So collectively, we can see through these spaces and the activities taking place within them, China's and America's shared Cold War-era anxieties and the extent to which both depended upon and produced architectural conditions of a distinctive remove from the environments in which they existed. Rooms nested within rooms capable of operating independently of their urban surroundings. This deep interiority was demanded by the delicate intelligence maneuvering network, the need for secure communications with home governments, and the shared pervasive uncertainty over how U.S.-China relations would proceed. The possibility of the mission's failure inevitably influenced the activities and the spaces that enabled them. Design and construction choices were not determined with permanence in mind. The liaison office, for example, was designed to facilitate engagement, but it could not function as a working embassy, lest it be perceived as facilitating an active and robust diplomatic mission that, again, could not legally exist. And this brings us to the role of the Archeological Exhibition. In an effort to further rehearse the possibility of greater diplomatic and commercial linkages between mainland China and the United States, then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger proposed that a collection of 380 archaeological objects unearthed in China since 1949 be sent to the United States for display in New York or Washington, D.C. International interest in a traveling exhibition of imperial-era Chinese art and archaeology can be traced back to the 1960s, and I just learned about a show from Taiwan that traveled by ship over to the United States in the early 1960s, so that may actually be the seed of this exchange in the early 70s. It was not until in 1971, when Henry Kissinger secretly visited Beijing to organize President Nixon's visit, that he expressed interest in an exhibition to the Chinese government. Plans were subsequently secured for Chinese objects to travel specifically to the United States. Now, the show was also being negotiated with other governments in Western Europe at the time, and in fact was first launched in Paris at the Petit Palais in May 1973. Before traveling to the Royal Academy of Arts in London in September, the Austrian Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna in February, the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities in Stockholm in May 1974, and the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto in August, before traveling to Washington, D.C. And incidentally, and following the tour through the US, the exhibition also traveled to Manila, Hong Kong, and to Australia, where it circulated through Melbourne, Sydney, and Adelaide. And this is an image of the catalog cover. I'm always looking for good PhD students to expand the study. If anyone's interested in this type of research, let me know after the talk. But back to the United States. Over the course of 1973, and amid the exhibition's international touring schedule, both the American and the Chinese liaison offices were actively facilitating planning efforts for the show. By early 1974, however, American representatives had begun to detect a noticeable ideological shift within the party, as major state-run media outlets began to publish warnings concerning China's dangerous exposure to the undue foreign influence of capitalism. The noticeable chill in relations gave way to admissions of regret that rapprochement had perhaps occurred too quickly, and that the Gang of Four had again seized power within the party elite, resulting in what American officials admitted were, quote, absolutely unrealistic expectations, both on the Chinese and on the American sides, end quote. Plans for the exhibition to travel to the United States continued despite this ideological shift. And even as other ongoing efforts at cultural exchange, such as the production and distribution of Italian filmmaker Michelangelo Antonioni's film La Chine, or Zhongguo, was blocked by party radicals, led by the Gang of Four, for its perceived slander of Chinese society. And for those of you who have not seen Antonioni's documentary, essentially there are several shots of the Nanjing Bridge from underneath the bridge that the Gang of Four took particular offense to, the fact that it seemed to reveal both the tectonic specifics of the bridge itself, but it also showed some of the construction workers underneath the bridge hanging their laundry, which was seen as an embarrassment to China at the time. The incident exposed the political risks in seemingly innocuous acts of cultural interplay, and the need for more critically substantive assessment of the ideological power of cultural production in China at the time by foreign representatives. And similarly, plans for the Chinese exhibition's tour to the United States laid bare some of these challenges and these sensitivities. More specifically, the exhibition offered a rehearsal of the complex production of a logistical and procedural infrastructure that would be necessary in the event of an eventual normalization of diplomatic relations between the PRC and the United States. Prior to the object's arrival in Washington, for example, a series of special treaties were required to be drafted and signed that would ensure their safe and secure legal movement there. As part of these agreements, Chinese representatives reminded all participating foreign institutions to refer to China as the People's Republic of China. In preparation for the show, Chinese and American officials wrangled over the language dictating the standards for the object's shipping, handling, and maintenance. Valuation for insurance purposes was another key concern. Edits proposed by the State Department's legal counsel, for example, prompted a series of strict changes on the Chinese side. An additional round of edits on the part of both parties followed, prompting American observers to note that if the exhibition was going to take place, it would have to be on, quote, Chinese terms, end quote. National Gallery staff were also instructed on etiquette, which is sort of detailed here in these documents from the National Gallery, regarding greetings, handshakes acceptable, as well as proper drink types and the temperature of said drinks, non-alcoholic, served warm, and food preferences. The inherent awkwardness of such an unprecedented event in cross-cultural exchange was reified through the design of the exhibition itself. The show was not in itself devoted to Chinese architecture, but I think it offers insight into the need and the recognition that new physical and conceptual space was required to accommodate China's re-engagement with the United States, Canada, Japan, and other capitalist countries, and the kinds of demands that would be placed on design in mediating international relations with China. A host committee responsible for the exhibition's oversight in the US included representatives from several museums, the Department of State, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, just to give you a sense of the bureaucracies involved in the endeavor. Negotiations over the exhibition extended until October 1974, so well over a year, and less than 2 months before the show's scheduled opening. Throughout the design process, Chinese officials demanded that the exhibition adhere to the party's standard chronological framework, regardless of the variety of different curated forms it took upon its international journey through Europe and Canada before arriving in the US. In Washington, the sheer quantity of objects involved in the exhibition necessitated a complete reinvention of the National Gallery's ground floor, and that's what we see here. This is the proposed chronological timeline of the show, beginning with primitive societies, leading up through the Qin and the Han dynasties, and proceeding chronologically through each of the imperial dynasties up through the Qing. National Gallery exhibition designers struggled to adapt the show and its chronological requirements to the confines of the existing museum, eventually proposing a unidirectional course that extended from east to west and requiring a figure-8 movement through the facility's major circular gallery route. Exhibition designers worked on the show for more than a year and visited the exhibition 3 times in London, Paris, and Toronto to study potential layouts. And this is a floor plan that shows the lighting arrangement of the Royal Academy of London that was subsequently acquired by the National Gallery of Art so that they could study their curatorial approach to the show. In the end, the final exhibition as it appeared in the National Gallery in DC did follow the party's linear chronological narrative. And we can see that here from slave society up through the Warring States period, here again through the Sui dynasty, et cetera, up to the Qing and to the 20th century. The scale and the complexity of the endeavor necessitated what National Gallery representatives described as the design and construction of, quote, a museum within a museum, end quote, that transformed the National Gallery's entire ground floor into a new exhibitionary experience. Every object had to be positioned within a, quote, sealed environment and completely protected through special boxes produced especially for the National Gallery. The construction team later acknowledged that they had never had to build anything so precisely. Now, on one hand, the design process and the curatorial result was marked by a specific emphasis on interiority, which makes sense given the fragility and the pricelessness of the objects themselves. Such prominence is understandable given the fact that the climactic conditions required a very controlled interior environment. But at the same time, I would argue that we can also identify multiple notions of interiority at work within the show's history. One that moves beyond the pragmatics of the exhibition into the curatorial and the promotional procedures agreed upon by the Chinese government and the State Department. For example, China insisted that the exhibition include its own independent Chinese curatorial team, and that the exhibition catalog be produced in China, independently of the National Gallery's existing publication plans. More generally, National Gallery staff, as I mentioned, were instructed to pay careful attention to the customs of, quote, non-westernized Chinese, end quote. China's efforts to insulate and interiorize itself on foreign soil, as it were, also expressed itself through party efforts to ban press representatives from Taiwan, from South Korea, South Africa, and Israel during the exhibition's special press preview in DC, an effort that eventually prompted the preview's cancellation and generated significant controversy within the American press concerning the latitude seemingly given to a communist regime to defy freedom of the press laws in the United States. Further controversy arose from questions concerning the catalog's publication in China, where content could be edited and controlled by the party rather than by the National Gallery. Critics of U.S. policy toward China latched onto these and other perceived concessions made in relation to the exhibition as evidence not only that the United States was, quote, losing all over the world, end quote, but that the American spirit was, quote, enfeebled, end quote. The noted conservative pundit, William F. Buckley, Jr., argued that communist China was engaged in a psychological war in which Chinese cultural artifacts and history itself represented nothing more than weaponry aimed at neutralizing America's Cold War advantage. Many considered détente a losing battle within the broader context of the Cold War itself. And this is a few of the press clippings declaring the criticism of the show at the time of its opening. Now, unfortunately, and as one might imagine, there's very little evidence indicating any reception on the part of the Chinese public to the show and its reception in the United States. So I don't have that counterpoint to offer. But ultimately, and in the eyes of the American public, the deployment of Chinese culture proved convincing and effective. The exhibition was one of the most popular and best-known international art exhibitions of the decade, attracting approximately 370,000 visitors in Paris, over 750,000 visitors in London, and over 700,000 visitors in DC, helping to launch an era driven by the search for blockbuster, crowd-pleasing exhibitions at the National Gallery. The event was also valuable insofar as it revealed a range of ideological ambiguities surrounding China and its uncertain diplomatic and geopolitical status relative to the United States and other capitalist-inclined nations. China was not an ally, but neither was it considered an enemy in the same vein as the Soviet Union. Using the exhibition to demarcate and to test the parameters of this odd, uncertain ideological terrain proved a productive study of the difficulties that would become involved in more substantive commercial and diplomatic engagement moving forward. In this respect, the exhibition both presaged a more expanded scope of international relations in China's political and architectural culture after Mao, and also anticipated the production of controlled, secure environments like international hotels and special economic zones within which new and occasionally divisive forms of global exchange, from diplomacy to market-based financing to espionage to cross-cultural engagement, could all take place. From residential compounds to liaison offices to museum interiors, these new spaces tested architecture's aesthetic, programmatic, and semiotic capacity in late Mao-era China. And it required architectural thinking that consequently expanded the profession's role as well. Through such activity, architecture's capability to absorb the geopolitical and cultural tensions at work in its making and to translate those frictions into physical matter was expanded. In demarcating new physical and conceptual territory for international relations under Mao, these spaces accommodated shifts in China's geopolitical position relative to the world at large that would register more dramatically after 1978. And so we'll shift gears then and we'll jump that kind of classic 1978 divide to talk about the everyday environment in China show at the Pompidou. As China's international interactivity increased over the course of the late 1970s and the early 1980s, the need for these types of spaces grew accordingly. New building typologies emerged to accommodate increasingly varied types of economic, diplomatic, and cultural exchange. New forms of architectural knowledge also needed to be nurtured. As these pressures began to make themselves apparent within the built environment, they triggered changes within the profession of architecture in China itself. Architects emerged as important agents in these processes, capable of overcoming numerous logistical and political difficulties to produce a series of material and spatial strategies that paved the way for these new dynamics and environments to be realized. Such architecture shared a certain quality of detachment from their immediate surroundings that would continue to prove valuable as the party reconstituted itself through alternative forms of capital. And I show here an image for an international hotel that was proposed but not ultimately built, and evinces the search for these new spaces to accommodate foreign tourism, foreign visitors, and of course foreign capital. Now, with few Chinese architects or residents yet able to travel abroad to experience new kinds of architecture beyond what was available in China, exhibitions in post-78 China became important vessels through which the parameters of acceptable architectural subject matter could be established, refined, and disseminated to the population at large. In August 1980, for example, a display of imperial era and post-1949 Chinese architectural drawings was organized in Beijing. The show, sponsored by the Beijing Civil Engineering Society and held at the Soviet Friendship Palace, featured over 300 objects from the Beijing Institute of Architectural Design and the China Building Technology Institute, including representations of Lama pagodas and historical projects that had once been forbidden from public view during the Cultural Revolution. This was followed in June 1982 by the opening of an exhibition of more than 800 pieces of work by Hong Kong architects. The collection consisted entirely of photographs and drawings of notable post-war Hong Kong residential, commercial, and civic projects from 22 professional firms, Hong Kong's Housing Authority, and the School of Architecture at HKU, and included examples such as Hong Kong City Hall, completed by Alan Fitch and Ron Phillips in 1962, the Peak Tram's Upper Terminal by Chung Wan-an, completed in 1972, and the Jockey Club Sha Tin Racecourse, completed in 1978. So again, a broad survey of post-war architecture in Hong Kong. And these are a few images that show both the format, some of the images that traveled around China, and then of course the cities that hosted the exhibition. Major cities in all various corners of China. A reciprocal exhibition of historical Chinese architectural objects, including 112 panels of cities, palaces, temples, residential architecture, and gardens, opened in Hong Kong that August. These first early Reform era exhibitions share a curatorial inclination toward inclusivity, that is, including as much material as possible, that suggests their primary function was to introduce both the Hong Kong and the Chinese publics to an array of acceptable architectural ideas and production happening both within China, but also, of course, outside China in Hong Kong. Descriptive reviews of these events emphasize their pedagogical purposes, while revealing little in terms of any overarching curatorial framework or spatial organization. So essentially a kind of array of a multitude of different projects pasted on the walls of the various exhibition spaces. The era's arguably most ambitious architectural curatorial effort took place in France. Beginning in 1979, Chinese and French representatives launched plans to organize an exhibition about China's built environment. Titled Everyday Life in China, the show was eventually launched at the Pompidou Center in Paris from May 19th to September 20th, 1982. And I just noticed earlier this evening that there's an original poster of this exhibition at the Power Institute, so another happy coincidence. Like other contemporaneous exhibitions of architecture that were occurring in China at the time, the event aimed for a broad but relatively shallow comprehensiveness designed to introduce, but not necessarily enlighten the public as to the realities of life in early Reform-era China. Its origins derived from a trip to France in March 1979 by Zhang Kaiji, then chairman of China's Architectural Society, who traveled to Paris with the intention of discussing the organization of an exhibition focused on some aspect of the living environment of a Chinese village, and, quote, general life in China, end quote. France had been formative, of course, in the early intellectual development of several party leaders, most notably Deng Xiaoping, and its reemergence as a reliable partner in China's efforts to nurture its own cultural history, both at home and abroad, imbued the mission with a certain symmetry and political significance. Importantly, too, the selection of the Pompidou Centre as a potential venue for such an event dovetailed with efforts by Chinese designers back home to study and learn from recent international museum designs and construction in search of new models to be built in China. Zhang Kaiji's trip was in part enabled through the efforts of a French architect by the name of Xavier Lucioni, who had lived in China between January 1974 and September 1976, and a Chinese architect by the name of Lian Hua Lanhong, who had relocated to France from China following the Cultural Revolution. Both of these figures became important conduits between French and Chinese representatives as plans for the exhibition were negotiated and then eventually confirmed. In December, two delegations of Chinese officials traveled to France, including one led by Duan Yuan, Minister and Vice President of the State Commission, and another one by Liu Kai-chu, Deputy Director of the Central Institute of Beaux-Arts, who escorted 11 Chinese sculptors to France in relation to another possible exhibition. In June 1980, the Pompidou Center hosted several Chinese poets for a revue parlée, or public sharing session, including Ai Qing, father of the artist Ai Weiwei, Gong Luosun, Liu Baiyu, and Ma Feng, an event that led to further discussions about an architectural-themed collaboration. So we can see sort of multiple cultural exchanges beginning to materialize and be conceived at this period of time. A team of Pompidou representatives subsequently traveled to China for a cultural exchange tour in October 1980, led by Jacques Molinder, the director of the Centre de Création Industrielle at the Pompidou Center, Hélène Laroche, the exhibition designer at the Pompidou at the time, and Xavier Lucioni, the French architect who was facilitating much of this communication. As in the earlier exhibition of archaeological objects, we can understand the exhibition at the Pompidou as a kind of conduit for cultural exchange with logistical complexities and sensitivities that would rehearse some of the subsequent requirements of more substantive diplomatic and economic negotiations. By February 1981, an organizational team of Chinese designers affiliated with the Architectural Society of China and Pompidou Center representatives, including Zhang Kaiji, He Jiangxiang, Yuan Helin, Jacques Molinder, Hélène Laroche, Hua Lanhong, and Lucioni, had mapped out the physical and the temporal parameters of this exhibition, which would be installed in the gallery of the Création Industrielle. Interestingly, and like the archaeological exhibition of years prior, the curatorial strategy deployed a kind of museum within a museum strategy. As you can see, the layout for the exhibition consisted of a kind of interiorized octagonal installation divided into rural and urban sections, which we can see here, the rural from the urban, centered around a courtyard-like area within which films and performances could be held over the course of the exhibition. Visitors were expected to enter into the display structure via the rural section, shown here, and so we can make out the rural section is demarcated by R, and the urban section is demarcated by U, so you can see it roughly split here in the middle. The rural section consisted of a series of 4 partitioned rooms holding mounted boards, models, and photographs depicting China's countryside and cities, along with shelves holding particular manufactured objects and other goods. A model of a Suzhou garden extended from one side of the display, and that's this sort of appendage shown here, sandwiched between a projected newsreel of pre-1949 events in Chinese society and a series of drawings, photographs, and objects depicting life in the built environment of 5 selected Chinese cities, the urban section of the show, which included Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shaoxing, and Tangshan. Images of several old and recently constructed rural homes were juxtaposed with scale models, drawings, life-size mock-ups, furniture, maps, everyday objects, photographs, and videos detailing various aspects of the Chinese countryside. And again, at the installation center and accessible through a series of abstracted moon gates was this theater-like space, this courtyard, designed to support slideshows of images and performances or talks with 3 large screens and a sort of seating arrangement as well. Everyday Life in China, which eventually ran from May 19th until September 20th, 1982, produced images, objects, and environments that expanded upon the party's still nascent narrative of reform-era modernization. Very little of the material displayed had been previously seen outside China, and included plans of low-rise and high-rise apartment blocks, urban maps, recently built rural courtyard constructions, you can see here, details of various decorative motifs, and interior arrangements of rooms that redefine the existing images and international impressions of China up to that point in time. photographs of street activity, daily labor, public exercise, children and elderly subjects, all aim to reconstruct a certain social milieu for the country's physical fabric. Objects including thermoses, fans, televisions, furniture, and enamel plates all provided visitors with a sense of China's recent manufacturing trends, while diagrams of social structure recreated some of the social systems at work in the country. And these are two images that show some of the life-size scale models that were built as part of the show. These life-size fragments of spaces and buildings help to simulate actual engagement with the everyday spaces of China itself. Paradoxically, the show suggested that both the countryside and the city in China represented sites of change and everyday modernity. The catalyst, or the catalysts for this change, were buildings and material objects, which were depicted as ensuring that both rural and urban residents felt a part of the new post-Mao China and the progress taking shape. In reality, China's countryside was one of the first environments where economic reforms began to take place, though it was generally to China's cities that foreign observers looked for some of the more obvious evidence of the country's physical transformation. In that respect, the exhibition challenged those assumptions with models and depictions of new architectural spaces in the countryside as well as in the city that suggested a comprehensive evenness to reform's physical results. The monolithic scale of China's cities contrasted with the textured vernacular fabric of its countryside, were intended to offer a wide spectrum of physical realities in which architecture was participating and fulfilling a vital public role in bettering Chinese society. Interestingly, and missing from the exhibition, were other active conduits for development, including international hotels and special economic zones. Instead, the images and the objects provided as part of the show offered a very specific narrative for progress, one rooted in processes of physical development that remained firmly under the aesthetic and the spatial control of the party. In this respect, each object accommodated the party's ideological constraints, while presumably satisfying the expectations of an international audience eager to experience any simulacrum of China, even if it was removed from some of the country's political, economic, and social realities. As in the pre-1978 exhibition of archaeological objects, the exhibition's content was organized in accordance with the party's standard historical chronology. Visitors were informed about the deterioration of Chinese society during the imperial period, the trauma of the Opium War, and China's drift towards social chaos prior to 1949. The exhibition itself, designed of course in the form of a vernacular Chinese architecture, helped to reinforce this narrative of progress. Here, an emphasis on interiority suggested a China that was in the process of change, yet still able to retain its cultural specificity. New but important messaging for a party transitioning away from the strident anti-feudal rhetoric of Chairman Mao. Everyday life in China was not the only architecture exhibition co-organized between China and a foreign government, nor was it the only China-themed exhibition organized at the Pompidou. And this is an exhibition that unfortunately I was not able to include in my book project, but it's a fascinating show that was installed 2 years later in 1984, in which the Pompidou was actually transmitting live television broadcasts from China every afternoon for about a week in January 1984. And I don't know of anything that's been written about this show, and I was not able to find very much in the archives. So again, any PhD or prospective PhD students out there, come see me after, and we can talk. So even though everyday life in China was not the only architectural exhibition organized between China and a foreign government, or even the only China-themed exhibition organized at the Pompidou, it was one of the first exhibitions of its kind to emphasize ordinary objects and spaces in Chinese life. And it offered a relatively unheroic representation of the country that still reinforced the party's rule. In this respect, it offers an intriguing complement to the exhibition of archaeological objects. which represented, of course, an earlier pre-1978 attempt on the part of the government to grapple with the country's cultural history and subsume it within a broader party-accepted narrative. In both cases, objects and exhibition design more generally was deployed to project a particular message that counteracted the themes of social unrest and instability that were still associated with China, even as it had transitioned away from the Cultural Revolution and towards a post-78 reform era. These objects on display and the processes of design at work in their curation helped to stabilize or restore China's global image at an important consequential moment of transition. As acts of restoration, these exhibitions also represented acts of renewal, with a respectful, celebratory treatment of historical Chinese customs, iconography, and spaces that obscured the extent of what had been lost in the recent past and redirected attention toward China's future. Both events gestured toward what Helen LaRoche, again the Pompidou exhibition's curator, posed in her concluding essay, which I show here, in the exhibition catalog. Titled Toward a Chinese Design, LaRoche argued that through displays of Chinese objects, architecture, and built environments abroad, there suddenly appeared a kind of, quote, conceptual room or space within the habits, daily practices, and graphic standards of industrialized countries for China. It seemed that the capitalist global order would be able to accommodate China, and that China might, in turn, have something to offer capitalism, particularly through the process of design. Though what that might be remained an unanswered, tantalizing question. Thank you. Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Wait. Yeah, John.
Some Chinese art historians said that. Sorry, some Chinese art historians said over a number of years that there was a great deal of knowledge about postmodernism in architecture, particularly with reference to Jameson, that Jameson wasn't the first, he was just the first one to appear as a grand maître or something. And I'm wondering what was going on in the informal internal communications of the Architects Association. As we know, does go on. I should say that the Artists Association and I presume the Architects Association had internal newsletters which were not for public release right up until '89, even later.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what was going on in the internal communications of the architects.
Sure.
And indeed, whether Jenks's What is Postmodernism was 74 was translated into Chinese very early, but in this informal circulation system. So it's no surprise that these things appear 10 years later.
Yeah, great question. In fact, I devote a whole chapter of the book to postmodernism, and the elite within the Architecture Society of China were aware of postmodernism. They had copies of Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture that was circulated. They were receiving architectural journals from abroad. But postmodernism as a term doesn't enter popular circulation until 1980 in a particular issue of Zhenju Shuibao that discussed postmodernism. Now, interestingly, postmodernism was translated initially as a neo-modernism, not a postmodernism. That was the same phenomenon that happened actually in the United States. You had people like Paul Goldberger and Robert Stern who were initially referring to the work of people like, Stern's own work, were initially referring to their work as a kind of neo-modernist architecture before devising this neologism of postmodernism. And then Jenks's book comes along, and so suddenly postmodernism has a terminology and has a definition. So
Jenks used the word in 1974.
1974, and then travels to China with his wife, Maggie Keswick, who's the heiress to the Jardine Matheson fortune. And her father, Sir John Keswick, was invited very, very early on in the first year or so of reform to re-engage with China. And so Jenks travels along through Hong Kong. Actually, he lectures at the University of Hong Kong on postmodernism, and then also lectures on postmodernism at Tsinghua, of all places, to architectural professors and to the faculty there. So that's 1979, 1980. So yeah, postmodernism emerges in China as a discourse very, very early on, and there's initially a kind of almost a euphoria about what it might mean that China can kind of re-engage with its past without dealing with the sensitivities of the Cultural Revolution. But then over time, the recognition is made that postmodernism is not simply a re-engagement with history, but comes from this cultural logic of late capitalism. And then it becomes an incredibly controversial term, and it quickly falls out of favor by the mid-1980s. So there's this fascinating kind of trajectory to, the history of postmodernism that during the reform period that I talk about.
Thank you.
Yeah. And incidentally, I should just add, sorry, Jenks's book was initially translated without his permission. So I interviewed him a couple times, and he said that he went to lecture in Shanghai. This would have been maybe 1983, and he was presented with an unauthorized Chinese translation of the book by the translator, who was incredibly excited to share it with him. So, and he was not offended. He was more bemused and flattered than anything else.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And I might be asking a question kind of across disciplines right now. But I found it very interesting. I found very interesting the mention of temporality and time that was very persistent during your talk about space, design, and architecture. So you were talking about this anticipation of change in design and architecture. You were talking about this idea of the Chinese government trying to convey a particular historical line throughout the exhibitions, and then this talk about reform that was part of the narrative that they were building through the Pompidou exhibition as well. So I was wondering whether you can kind of talk a bit more about this. Is there an emergent and specific idea of time and temporality? Because you were talking a lot about what did you say, introversion, or sorry, I might be
Interiority.
Interiority.
Oh, yeah.
So I kind of wonder how these go together.
Mm-hmm.
What if you can talk about that?
Sure. Those are two themes that kind of thread throughout the book project, but I wanted to emphasize them here in the hopes of getting feedback and questions, so I appreciate your question. But essentially, they're both arguments of mine that are in response to some broader disciplinary shifts within architectural history. In the past, architecture has been seen as a monument or reaction to moments of change, that the change occurs and then architecture somehow reflects that change through aesthetic means, through some sort of stylistic manner or method. And I'm trying to give architecture a bit more agency, or understand the way that architecture in some ways can be seen as I said, and as you quoted me, anticipating changes ahead. So the way that I see, at least, both of these exhibitions working, is that they are allowed to do things that aren't necessarily being allowed to take place in other spaces in China. That the exhibition becomes a kind of exceptional space of sorts. And now, granted, both of them are not located within China, and I focused on two international exhibitions, with the idea being that there was still a kind of lack of consensus about where China was going and what liberalization meant and what reform signified. And so through these exhibitions, some of those questions are being worked out, they're being rehearsed. Some of the narratives about reform are being designed, as it were. And so that's the element of time that I'm trying to work with. Now, in relationship to space and interiority, in studying the Reform era and trying to locate buildings that are doing some of this anticipation or contributing to early reform processes, I noticed that they all share a very distinctive kind of confined, constrained-like quality, whether it's a special economic zone, which is only limited to certain residents, or something like the International Hotel, which average Chinese citizens were not allowed to enter. There were doormen who would prevent people from actually entering into hotel interiors unless they had proof that they were supposed to meet with an international guest. So these hotels function as kind of micro-economic zones of sorts where business deals and transactions can take place. I see the exhibitions as operating in a similar way, this kind of interiorized space where certain things can happen and certain things can be seen that may not necessarily be as prevalent outside those spaces. So that's where this idea of interiority comes from, and I trace it through a series of kind of different spatial examples and building types that emerge in China during the Reform era. I hope that might answer your question, but maybe not. Yeah, okay.
Carl, thank you so much for your talk. I enjoyed it very much, although it was different from what I had expected, judging from the title of the talk, because I thought you would talk about, Guangzhou Exhibition Hall, or, the Beijing International Exhibition Hall. But you end up talking about these two exhibitions. There has been, a lot of, literature on colonial exhibitions, and clearly these two exhibitions are very different from, that sort of discourse. It's, they are exhibitions happen during the Cold War period. So I just wonder, how that Cold War mentality played a role in terms of, conceptualizing the exhibition or the perception of the exhibitions.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. The Cold War is a really vital contextual and temporal framework for understanding both of these shows, in large part because the Cold War was such an era of ideological polarization that the idea that a communist country and a capitalist country would cooperate on anything seemed impossible to imagine. And so where these exhibitions become important, and I sort of gestured towards that in my talk, was that through these kinds of these cultural events, and I don't like this term myself, but some people might refer to these events as sort of a soft power-like event, where it's not the kind of hard power of diplomacy, but it's a softer ping-pong diplomacy, if you will. And exhibitions were, I think, part of that narrative and part of that history, that there was so little that China and the United States could agree upon. And of course, when you add the sensitivities of Taiwan, that culture and exhibitions are one of the few zones or arenas where there could be some common ground found and identified and designed, as it were. So these in particular, the exhibition of archaeological objects is a really formative moment where the legal difficulties, the diplomatic difficulties can be worked out, because there's no existing infrastructure to depend upon. And I get into this a bit more in the book, but there are these kind of fascinating memos that circulate through the State Department in the moment when the liaison office strategy has been agreed upon, because they realize that they need to pass laws through Congress incredibly quickly so that China can buy real estate, so that they can buy buildings in DC. There's no legal basis for the Chinese government to be able to do that. So it's through these kinds of cultural events that kind of legal, that those kinds of legal procedures can be enacted and can be implemented. And then through the exhibition, that framework for more substantive, deeper, more difficult political negotiation, diplomatic negotiation can be built upon it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk, and especially the points made about the, I suppose, like quarantine space of the exhibition and so on, as a kind of precursor to the special economic zone in some ways. But isn't it also a continuation of extraterritoriality, the same kind of extraterritoriality of treaty ports? Is that. And also I'm just really interested in the examples you gave of the mid-century modern architecture that's being built in the mid-70s in a number of places prior to the end of the Cultural Revolution. Really, really interesting. It's almost a kind of instance of postmodernism itself, you know, in especially some of those buildings, the kind of, you know, mid-century meets the remnants of Art Deco, you know, built on the remnants of Beaux-Arts.
The buildings built in China that I showed earlier?
Yes, the earliest ones. And I assume on that beautiful Guangzhou exhibition hall that the calligraphy is Mao's, I suppose, that was on cigarette packs and the like.
I believe it was inspired, by Mao's calligraphy, the decorative detail. The architecture itself, reflects this relative moment of calm and, again, détente in that period, 71, 72, when the Gang of Four has been chastened in a way, and Zhou Enlai and his moderate allies have kind of reclaimed Mao's attention. And the architecture that's being produced at that time reflects some of that openness that architects can, and other people have written about this, including Zhu Jianfei in Melbourne, about how Chinese architects can actually make reference to American architecture at that moment. And it's just it's a brief window, but he's discussed how the architects responsible for the diplomatic compound were influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, I don't make that claim myself, but he's traced the popularity of Frank Lloyd Wright in Chinese architectural schools in the 1950s to then its reemergence at this specific moment in the early 1970s. So yeah, there is a number of different influences that are kind of coming together and materializing through these buildings. To your first question about extraterritoriality, there are vestiges of extraterritorial privilege that certainly, I think, reemerge within the context of reform. Extraterritoriality is something that I engaged with a bit more comprehensively in my first book on Shanghai and the treaty port system, understandably. But the difference with the reform era is that there's no legal basis for extraterritoriality. So if there is any kind of semblance of extraterritorial privilege taking place, it's something that's specific within the party's governing apparatus at that period of time. But there's no legal standing for that kind of privileged existence. Now, of course, the party sees it in its best interest to segregate foreign businessmen from the population at large. And so by quarantining, your term, by quarantining them in these international hotels, the hope is that they will limit any undue foreign influence upon the Chinese population. And you do see some conversations being had about how to best kind of limit and control foreign activity around international hotels. But of course that's unsuccessful because all of the staff of the hotels are Chinese. And so they begin to participate in liberalization by getting tips from foreign business people and buying leather jackets and getting gifts, and then these imbalances begin to appear. But it's not legalized. It's largely a kind of spontaneous, informal process. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Cole. Also, I'm very, I feel like the lecture is quite different from what I expected, as Duan Fang just said. As myself has worked in museum as a curator for 30 years, both in China and in Singapore and here. But I just want to, I thought you were going to talk about the design of the exhibition in China. But anyway, I still enjoyed your talk very much. You mentioned in your lecture there was one hotel, was it called Chonghua Hotel? Was
the Xiong-Xiong-Hua.
Xiong-Hua,
Yeah,
and then
Xiong-Hua.
was designed but wasn't wasn't built.
That's right.
Yeah, and then in the slides you said the designer is a foreign name, but it's. I was just wondering because I think we know like IMP started to build hotels since 1979, and I think the first foreign non-Chinese architect who built a museum in China is Lo Yicheng, and actually it's the museum I worked on since 1987. Oh. Yes, so I was just wondering, see those two gentlemen there.
Yeah.
I mean the reason. Yeah, can you tell us why the museum wasn't, built? And then the reason why, both IMP and Lo Yicheng, he was also overseas Chinese, ABC.
Yeah.
Is it something to do with because they are Chinese descendant? And then versus non-Chinese descendant, that's why there was, I'm just curious.
Sure, no, good question. Yes, it does. You said it, not me. So this is one of the earliest hotel projects that was being launched at the same time as Pei was negotiating for the construction of the Fragrant Hills Hotel outside Beijing. And of course, the narrative is that the party initially wanted Pei to build a high-rise in the center of Beijing, and he refused. He wanted to build it in this imperial retreat located outside the city center and engage with the landscape. And he was allowed to do so, perhaps because he was arguably the most famous Chinese person outside of China in the world at that period of time, but it's not completely known. But he was given certain liberties in his hotel project. This was a project that came out of, initially actually out of an exchange tour. John Carl Warnecke, who's the last name here, he was in charge of what was then the largest architectural firm in the United States, based in Los Angeles. And in 1972-73, he attended an American Institute of Architects tour of China with IMP and a number of other American architects. And coming out of that tour, both of them, coincidentally, were some of the first people to receive commissions for international hotels after 1978. Warnecke's was not successful, and this article that I source here, Architecture California, by a man by the name of Roger Hong, who was on that architectural team, talks a bit about why it was not successful. And it was essentially due to a variety of linguistic challenges, cultural misunderstandings, and also divergent architectural practices that the American team and the Chinese team simply could not find common ground upon which to work. And the project got to a fairly comprehensive stage before completely being abandoned. And the American team never heard about the project again until then. I think it's 1985, 1986, the Kunlun Hotel, the Kunlun Fandian in Beijing, which has this same serpentine-like form and the same rotating restaurant on the top, same basic form, magically materializes by the Beijing Institute of Architectural Design. Now, there's no proof about what the provenance of those plans were or who designed them, but it is a coincidence of some kind, and there are a number of striking formal similarities between the two projects. But your question about Pei, I've written an article that in addition to that exhibition, that talks a bit about Pei's involvement and Clement Chen's involvement in China, and people like John Portman and the Great Wall Hotel, the Changcheng Fandian. So I would encourage you to check that article out too if you're interested. It was published in Grey Room Journal in 2015, I think.
Yeah, apparently when I worked on that project, I was told that like a big university approached Pei to build a museum in our university.
Oh.
And he turned it down. I don't know why.
Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, great. That I don't know. I know that Pei was approached by a Hong Kong developer for the hotel project, a family friend, and that he was brought in onto that team, and that initially they were going to complete 3 or 4 hotels in different cities along the Chinese coast, and the Fragrant Hills project emerged out of those negotiations.
Thanks so much. It's been really fascinating. I was actually curious about the hotels and the diplomatic spaces kind of in the earlier phase, at the beginning of the 70s, still within the Cultural Revolution. Just because I had heard that around that same time, Joanne Lai was kind of rehabilitating a lot of ink painters and things like that to make paintings that would populate what I assume would be these same spaces. And so just how you're thinking about the relationship between those two things, especially if you've got a kind of even American strain in that whole architectural movement.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So as the early projects that I started the lecture with, just kind of flashed them up, the diplomatic residential compound, the Beijing Hotel, the Friendship Store, the International Club, as those projects are being completed, there's a discussion among Joe and other moderate leaders that these spaces need to be decorated in some way, and that paintings should be installed in these interiors to give foreign visitors a sense of China. And this narrative of inside-outside also emerges within the context of that conversation, because it's ultimately deemed acceptable because no Chinese residents are going to see these paintings. These are for foreign guests only. So foreign guests should get this carefully constructed, curated, interiorized experience of China. So painters are, brought back from the countryside and given work to design paintings and to produce paintings. And then the Gang of Four challenges it and mounts a series of exhibitions on what they call these black paintings. And so the effort is ultimately scrapped. So it's very short-lived. But yeah, and then it ends. And then there's this another sort of ideological stalemate between 1974 and 1975 between Gang of Four and Zhou-aligned party members. Yeah.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for the lecture. Very interesting. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about milieu of exhibition designer, whether something like that happened or whether there were still architects working occasionally on the exhibitions. And this is also connected, I think my question is connected a little bit with this notion of exhibitions as a site for reflection for Chinese government, who they want to be, how they want to present themselves. So my following question would be perhaps whether there is any exchange between those people, those designers/architects who are working on the exhibitions, and bureaucrats, whether any tension internally about which kind of vision, which kind of notion of China they want to present to the external world.
Great. There were trained architects who were on the design team at the National Gallery, and also who were involved in the Chinese and French teams that designed the Pompidou exhibition. So designers were very much part of the conversation. The archival documents it's a little difficult to kind of reconstruct exactly those, the dynamics of the relationship, but it's clear that architects were considered major contributors to this effort. And that was the point I was trying to make briefly when I described the architects as agents in this process, that they were actually serving almost a kind of diplomatic role, that designers were being relied upon to realize the spaces that officials wanted to use to project these narratives, these images of China. So it's an important role, obviously, and a consequential role for architects that deserves attention. Again, I think to the second part of the question about the specific negotiations, though, or the specific relations, I've interviewed a few folks from the National Gallery, and then I interviewed Lucioni, and I've read the memoirs of Lan Huahong, and they all talk about the difficulties given the cross-cultural international dynamics of the projects. They talk about language, of course, comes up quite a bit, that it was difficult to communicate. But interestingly, and actually this gets us back to this image, in this article by Roger Hong, who's the Chinese-American architect on the Warnke team, he said that actually architecture was an important and essential contributor to reform because it was not only linguistic in nature, that drawings could communicate ideas. And even though you had people who only spoke Chinese or people who only spoke English, that somehow the language of architecture, diagrams, sections, elevations, plans could be used to facilitate interaction. So.
My question aside, I need the time. But I have nothing else but to thank you again. One thing I forgot to mention actually is that very recently, unfortunately I can't say it's on now, very recently Cole was also the co-curator of a really interesting exhibition in Tin Sheds, which included basically research about Australian architects active in Asia, including in Hong Kong and fusion of horizons. So if you have a chance to come check it out, information about that online.
It's now online. The exhibition's closed, but yeah, it lives on online.
Thank you again. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you.